Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching vSphere 5.1 Single Sign-On, or SSO. We'll start this lesson off by answering the question, what is vSphere 5.1 Single Sign-On? We'll discuss why it's so important and why you need to know about it right now before you start installing VMware vSphere 5.1. A critical new piece of any VMware vSphere 5.1 infrastructure is the new VMware Single Sign-On, or SSO. SSO serves as an authentication broker and security token exchange for the virtual infrastructure. SSO has its own local database, or it can use the users for that security database from the server where SSO is installed. No longer is Windows Active Directory the security domain for the virtual infrastructure. Single sign-on provides your virtual infrastructure its own security domain. How this works is once you're authenticated with the single sign-on server, you receive a security token that can then authenticate you with multiple vSphere components. Previously, it was VMware vCenter with vSphere 5 that was authenticating you to do a number of different things, and that was backed up by the Active Directory username and password database. New with vCenter 5.1, as you see on the graphic on the right, vCenter can be broken out into different components. You've got the vSphere web client, which you optionally install, but most likely really want to. You've got the vCenter server. You've got the vCenter inventory service. And then you've got the vCenter single sign-on. That's how it works if you're running VMware vCenter for Windows. If you're using the VCSA, or the vCenter server appliance, that's the Linux-based virtual appliance installation of vCenter, the single sign-on service comes already pre-installed with the default configuration, simply deployed inside the VCSA virtual appliance. Here's how it works. If you start at the graphic on the left-hand side where it says number 1, you log in with your username and password, let's say using the vSphere web client. From there, you're requesting the single sign-on server to issue a token based on your username and password is used to authenticate against the single sign-on database, and that could be the local single sign-on database locally to that server, or it could actually go out to the Windows Active Directory and check to see if your username and password is valid. From there, if we look at number 4, on the left-hand side, the token from the single sign-on server is sent back to the web client, and then that web client can then use the login token to connect to multiple VMware virtual infrastructure resources and services. So if you start on the left, you've got vCenter 1, vCenter 2, VCO, which is vCenter Orchestrator, VMware vShield Manager, which is now called VCNS, or vCloud Networking and Security, and then VCD, or vCloud Director. In other words, this single token that you've received allows you to authenticate to multiple VMware virtual infrastructure services and applications running across multiple VMware virtual appliances and even multiple virtual data centers, perhaps even spread around the world. So you can have multiple single sign-on servers. They can be configured across multiple sites. They can also be configured in a highly available configuration so that if a single vCenter sign-on server goes down, that doesn't mean that you're unable to authenticate to the virtual infrastructure. So how do you install VMware vSphere 5.1 single sign-on? Let me show you. The first option is to simply install vSphere SSO along with the vCenter Server 5.1 installation when you install vCenter Server from the media that you download from VMware.com. This could be the zip file that you extract, or it could be the ISO image that you mount to install VMware vCenter. You'll find this single sign-on is one of the components that you install. Another alternative is when you deploy the vCenter Server Appliance version 5.1 and bring up vCenter using that Linux-based virtual appliance, you'll find that single sign-on is automatically installed by default. Now, if you're doing an upgrade, I've got a separate lesson on upgrading VMware vSphere from version 5 to 5.1. The single sign-on service must be taken into account, or else the upgrade, I'll just tell you, is not going to work. It's not going to be successful without single sign-on. Single sign-on is now a required piece of a VMware virtual infrastructure. So if you just have a single sign-on server, you just have a single vCenter server, and most likely single sign-on is just installed along with the vCenter server services on Windows or along with the vCenter server appliance, you don't have too much to think about. You just need to know that single sign-on is there and its basic role. But if you want to configure a multi-site deployment or a highly available configuration, these are going to have more complexity and will require more planning, and you'll need to read a lot more. The first resource that I recommend is the vSphere 5.1 Single Sign-On Resources Frequently Asked Question, which is found in VMware Knowledge Base article 2034918. So at this point, I'd like to go two different places and show you single sign-on in action. The first one is the vCenter Server Appliance, and then from there, I'll show you where you would go about installing single sign-on along with vCenter Server for Windows. If you're interested in upgrading, again, check out my lesson on upgrading VMware vSphere. Here inside my newly installed VMware vCenter Server Appliance version 5.1, I want to point out a couple different areas where the single sign-on service is monitored and configured if you choose to use this option. So here on the Summary tab for this vCenter server, we immediately notice that we've got some of those different components I just showed you back in our slides for vCenter Server 5.1. We've got the server of vCenter Server broken out, and it's currently running. We've got the inventory service broken out, and it's running. We've got the local database, which is the embedded database for vCenter, and then the local or embedded database for single sign-on. Notice that Active Directory authentication is disabled. So by default, we're not using Windows Active Directory for our username and password authentication to get things done as administrators in the virtual infrastructure. That's something we could very easily configure here. However, the vCenter single sign-on service has its own local database that you can continue to use. To configure single sign-on, you just go in here to the single sign-on section. And then notice by default, the single sign-on deployment type that we're using is the local embedded database. We could choose to use an external database, and in that case, we'd have to scroll down here to the embedded SSO database section, where we would fill out this information once we've saved these settings. That would include the database type, the database server, port, instance, login, password, and so forth. Now, to be honest, as long as you have a simple single sign-on deployment, that being just a single sign-on service as part of VCSA or as part of vCenter Server for Windows, there really isn't a lot to configure related to single sign-on, unless you start to get complex and you start to have multiple sites with multiple single sign-on servers, or if you want to do high availability for your single sign-on servers. So this is one option for using and configuring the new vSphere single sign-on. The other option, as I mentioned earlier, is to install single sign-on off of the vCenter server installation media. Let me show you what that would look like. Here I am on a Windows server that I plan to use as my VMware vCenter server, running version 5.1, of course. I've inserted the ISO installation media in the virtual CD/DVD drive for this virtual machine. And as you can see, the installer comes up here, and it actually looks quite different from VMware vCenter 5. That's because the services, as I talked about, have been broken out. So here you've got the vCenter simple installation. This is if you just want to install all the critical pieces you need on one server and do it at the same time. That's how I usually do it. But if you want a more complex installation, you can go down here and you can install these services individually. So here, notice the vCenter single sign-on service as part of this vCenter 5.1 installation media. I can install this individually, so I can have a separate Windows server, perhaps as part of a high availability solution for SSO, where I install single sign-on by itself just on that server. And then, of course, I can install the other pieces here individually, like the vCenter inventory service or the vCenter server service. Of course, I can also deploy the traditional Windows-based vSphere client, as well as the vSphere web client installation, which you're required to do on a vCenter server for Windows installation with vSphere 5.1 if you want to use the vSphere web client. And then finally, there's Update Manager. So let's say that you were moving from VMware vSphere 5 to vSphere 5.1, and all you did was just upgrade VMware vCenter server, I'll tell you you're going to run into problems because vCenter server with version 5.1 requires the single sign-on service or the single sign-on application to be deployed actually first before the vCenter server is deployed. So there's a number of things you need to know. If you just choose the simple installation option here, most likely you won't have any problems. But once you start to break these pieces off individually or perform upgrades from a previous version of VMware vCenter and vSphere, you really need to know your stuff. And I hope you've learned some of that stuff in this lesson. If you're performing an upgrade, of course, I also highly recommend the upgrade guide available from VMware for vSphere 5.1. So that's it. That's the VMware single sign-on service. Those are some of the basics of what it does, why it's so critical, and how it works. And then I showed you two different places where you could install and configure the VMware vCenter 5.1 single sign-on service. So with that, let's go back to our slides. And with that, we've reached the end of this lesson on the new vSphere 5.1 single sign-on service that's such a critical piece of a VMware vSphere 5.1 and vCenter 5.1 virtual infrastructure. Thanks for watching.